Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Where were you? September 3rd, 2009. That's a question they'll be asking kids and grandkids for years to come. That was the first episode of the Keiser Report. Yes, 10 years ago today, the Keiser Report began broadcasting all over the world. Hundreds of countries, billions of people. Stacy.
10 years ago this month, indeed, we started here in Paris. So while we're here in Paris, I wanted to record this special. There are some controversies about when the first episode actually aired.
Of course.
Because of YouTube and how they upload and date things. But nevertheless, I want to look back a little bit on what we experienced here in Paris at the beginning of our journey of Keiser Report 10 years ago. And what I realized looking back, and anybody could do that because it's all on YouTube, go Keiser Report episode 1, episode 2, episode 3, episode 4. Just watch those first episodes. I'm going to look at episode 1 and 3 at the moment because in episode 1 we interviewed Danny Schechter, the news dissector, who has since passed away, but he was an independent journalist who at the time had just made a film called Plunder, the Crime of Our Time. So we started our first episode talking about the financial collapse, the ongoing bailouts, the trillions of dollars. And this first little clip, before we turn to the interview with him, I want to show you that actually Nomi Prinz makes an appearance in our very first episode of Keiser Report.
Let's turn to Danny Schechter, author of this book, this book, The Crime of Our Time. He's also the creator of a film that's now out and available. It's called Plunder, The Crime of Our Time.
I followed up with a book that came out before Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. Speaking on Wall Street, I called for a jailout, not a bailout.
I used to think of Wall Street as a financial center. I now think of it as a crime scene.
Now it's time to make the case for why the financial crisis is a crime story. And I'm not the only one who sees it this way. Nomi Prinz was a managing partner at Bear Stearns and Goldman Sachs.
This is the most expensive takeout, the biggest crime in world history. We're talking about a crime we can't even quantify. You're talking double-digit trillions of dollars minimum.
Yep. Trillions and trillions. You know, we, at the very beginning, were pointing fingers at easy money and the central banks as papering the crime wave. And that was an excellent clip by Nomi Prinz, who went on to become a regular on Keiser Report and written many books on the subject. And Danny Schechter, his whole approach talking about really plunder, the crime of our time. And that's also been a recurring theme for 10 years. It's only gotten worse. And we're seeing now, 10 years later, kind of the end game as negative interest rates, for example, would be an extension of what was the seed sown at that time of extraordinary overreach by central banks.
The theme of plunder is important because, again, it ties to France, and all of our work, is Bastiat said, when plunder it happens at the top, it starts to trickle down. This is when the way of the top is plunder. The whole society becomes corrupt, and it is corrupt. And this is part of why we have uprisings everywhere, why we have Brexit, why we have Trump. And these people at the time did not understand because Obama had just come in. Everybody was like, all hope and change, it's going to be great. But let's turn back to the video, the interview from episode 1 with Danny Schechter, where you go further into this plunder.
In your opinion, what caused the economic calamity?
Well, I see a trend over years, first of all, of a small elite dominating our economy and dominating decision-making, financialization, of the economy itself, so that a credit and loan complex began to dominate in the same way that a military-industrial complex dominated in earlier times. But then these people began to create a criminal scheme, which hasn't really been acknowledged as such, based on massive predatory mortgage fraud, securitization, and the misrepresentation of the value of so-called mortgage bundles of various kind that was sold around the world based on phony ratings, and then insurance schemes that enabled them to leverage on the basis of all of this and make a fortune, putting millions of families at risk, and as we see now, 14 million families facing foreclosure. So all of this was done with tremendous irresponsibility, a lack of regulation, a lack of oversight, and in fact complicity by our media and the government.
Right. So the banking loan complex kind of took over for the military industrial complex because, without actual bombs being dropped, you needed to feed the banks somehow. So they created weapons of mass financial destruction, as Warren Buffett called them. Before that, we just called them financial terrorists. And they went on to kind of ransack the global economy. They looted Greece. They looted Egypt. They're unstoppable because they got to feed the monkey. And the monkey is paper fiat money feeding the debt pile.
Speaking of feeding the monkeys, I want to go into the comment section on the very first episode of Keiser Report. It looks like it says 9 years ago. That's because it's actually 10 years ago. But the comments were, here's one, ha ha ha, this is awesome. I love your new show, Max. So people were pretty happy with it. Also, Stacy is pretty darn hot. I had to put that one.
Oh, right. No, that's true. I mean, I'm putting a supercut together, which just has 10 years of Stacy's hairdos.
And Max Keiser is so hyper. What is his caffeine intake? Like 30 cups a day?
Oh, yeah, 30 is a minimum. I mean, that's just to get started.
And wow, this real newscast has come a long way, and it just gets better and better. I appreciate and enjoy every episode. So glad to have found it. That is somebody who came to it 4 years after watching that first one and left a comment to say, wow, now watching it 4 years later, a lot of people had gone to this first episode at episode 1,000 when we had our 1,000 episodes anniversary. They went back and looked at
the approach was to look at it like a crime scene, what was happening in the banking sector, and to discuss central banks not as economists and policymakers, but as highly politicized with an agenda. And only 10 years later, with the recent comments with central banks saying they need to get involved in the 2020 election, do people understand what we've been saying now for 10 years?
I want to then turn to episode 3 before we cut to a break, because this was from Matt Taibbi. He was in episode 3. He was at Rolling Stone and he wrote this piece called Wall Street's Naked Swindle. So these themes of us covering the fraud as plunder is all about the fraud of the financial system. Naked Swindle. Matt Taibbi talks about the naked short selling that happened, that attacked Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, which had just collapsed in the previous year.
Matt Taibbi, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thanks very much for having me on, Max. It's an honor.
Criminals typically use guns and Smith & Wessons and what have you, but we're talking about financial crimes, and they use the weapon of a naked short sale. And as have you reported brilliantly in your pieces, naked short selling was used to demolish Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. And you brought this naked short selling into the public sphere of information, which really needs to be talked about. And I want to just touch on it again today. Can you talk a little bit about naked short selling and how it was used to transfer trillions of wealth from the taxpayers to a handful of brokers and bankers?
Well, naked short selling, all it really is selling shares of stock that you don't have. In a normal short sale, which is a very beneficial legal process, what you do is you borrow stock from somebody, you go out and you sell it on the market, you wait for the shares in that stock to decline, then you go out and you buy back the stock at a lower price, and you return it to the people you borrowed it from originally, and you pocket the difference. That's normal short selling, and it's a very beneficial process that helps ferret out inefficient or corrupt companies. Naked short selling is when you go out and you sell shares of stock that you don't actually have, and then you never deliver them. And what's bad about naked short selling is that it floods the market with extra shares of stock, that shouldn't be there, and it just naturally devalues the stock. And that's what happened with Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. And you can tell this because when there's lots of naked short selling going on, there are lots of shares that are sold and then never delivered. And the amount of undelivered shares skyrocketed with both Bear and Lehman Brothers in the first weeks of those crises.
Right. Matt Taibbi, of course, coining the phrase vampire squid to describe Goldman Sachs and their tentacle-like reach all over the world. It seemed like every financial catastrophe in the world had a Goldman Sachs banker, a former Goldman Sachs banker was involved in some way. And naked short selling is a topic that I knew from Wall Street because, of course, I spent many years on Wall Street from 1982 to 1990. I was a stockbroker. Payne Weber, Oppenheimer, Shearson Lehman Hutton, Alex Brown, and did billions of dollars worth of trades. And naked short selling is common practice, common knowledge on Wall Street. People outside of Wall Street didn't realize you could counterfeit sell orders to drive prices down, which is what a naked short sale is all about.
So this was, yes, counterfeiting, and you had gone on in that interview to call it counterfeiting. This is also the rise of Bitcoin that happened just at the same time, is a rejection of this fraud, of this plunder, of this counterfeiting. And of course, as he had pointed out, Bear Stearns had collapsed and JP Morgan got to take it over for pennies on the dollar, but they did inherit a massive naked short that Bear Stearns had of silver. So thus, came in a viral campaign. It went viral globally. International media covered it. You did crash JP Morgan, buy silver. And here's a little clip you did with RT at the time.
Hi, this is Max Keiser, host of the Keiser Report. I want to talk to you about this global viral campaign, crash JP Morgan, buy silver. The fact is that JP Morgan is a huge player in the derivatives market. They've got a balance sheet exposure of something like 1.5 trillion. A lot of that is tied to their silver shorts. That is to say, they have sold silver contracts that don't exist. They're engaged in naked short selling. This is a form of counterfeiting. Huge hedge funds around the world are buying lots of silver because they know that if they force JP Morgan to have to buy silver on the open market, they're going to make money. So what I'm saying is you can piggyback on these huge players. All you need to do is buy one silver coin, maybe two silver coins, demand physical delivery of that silver, thus forcing JP Morgan and these other financial terrorists to have to cover their negative bets and put a company like JP Morgan basically forcing them into bankruptcy because there's no way they can cover their liabilities if we all buy one silver coin and demand physical delivery. Put JP Morgan, a financial terrorist, out of business. Buy silver. Well, once again, my Wall Street background came in handy because, sometimes you see houses for sale for $1, and it's because you have to assume the mortgage, right? And
the taxes and the back taxes, yes.
So with JP Morgan buying Bear Stearns, it was a very cheap price, but they had to assume this enormous silver short position that the Bear Stearns was maintaining on behalf of the government, as well as some other gold shorts to keep the price of precious metals down. So I quickly figured out that the short position, if they had to force that buy back the silver to cover, would bankrupt JP Morgan. And JP Morgan's always been our bête noire on this show because they're, the capo de capo of Wall Street crooks. And so we got the price from about 15 to 50, and they were on the verge of having to have some serious write-downs, possibly, have a liquidity event. And then they got the government to change some laws, and they went even deeper into their short position temporarily. Now, when we come back from the break, we will kind of cover how that all resolved. Don't go away. Stay right there. Right, welcome back to Keiser Report 10-year anniversary special, looking back on some of the highlights. So the crash JP Morgan buy silver campaign, this was financial activism, how to use capitalism against capitalism. Something I had come up with and used in a number of different ways. This was to go after the balance sheet of JP Morgan, attack their short position by getting the world to buy physical silver, forcing them to have to buy in the open market. It almost worked in terms of they had to, declare a liquidity event, shut down, and go for a bailout. But they very occasionally got the government to expand their remit in terms of how much they could sell short. They escaped the sort of Damocles at that time. But I think ultimately we have to chalk this up as a victory.
There are two sorts of people in the world. The vast majority of them are not winners. Then there are people who are winners. And a lot of winning is fake it till you make it, and then you actually make it. Like Donald Trump faked it until he made it into the White House. Here, we forced JP Morgan to do this headline. This is our victory. A lot of people, most people in the YouTube comments will have said, we lost because JP Morgan did not go bankrupt, or the price of silver did not go to $500. But here is victory. Here is altering the fraudulent activity of a bank, the biggest bank in the world, supported by the biggest military and the biggest State Department and the biggest treasury in the world, JP Morgan. Here's the headline. JP Morgan has cornered the silver market via manipulation, August 2018. The world's largest stockpile of privately owned silver, 500 million ounces, is owned by one of the world's largest banks, JP Morgan Chase. In just 5 years, After our Crash JP Morgan Buy Silver campaign launched here on Keiser Report, in just the past 5 years, this article points out, JP Morgan Chase has accumulated the largest holding of physical silver in the world. In fact, prior to JP Morgan, there was only one other entity that owned more physical silver, and that was the US government. And that was over a century ago when silver coinage was in common use. So you identifying their weakness, their vulnerability, not going to the government or pleading to people to help us and give us some food stamps or bail us out, is like you identified the predatory plunderer and you identified a weakness and you said, target that, target those naked shorts. And what did they do? They made sure they're never vulnerable again like that. They went out and bought 500 million ounces of silver.
Right, I'm the apex predator.
Yes.
Jamie Dimon is my prey. You know, I got him to commit their balance sheet to buying 500 million ounces of silver. And so now they are a positive silver drone. I turned him into a silver drone. He's now my puppet because he's not going to go against silver now, is he? Because he's pro-silver. Same thing with Bitcoin. Initially, he came out against Bitcoin. Then he gradually became ambivalent about Bitcoin. Now he's positive Bitcoin, what I hear from my contacts. And he's going to become my Bitcoin drone very quickly. And so will all the big banks in the world and all the central banks in the world. I'm the apex predator. They are my puppets.
And again, like at that time, we were identifying to the audience around the world. Everywhere around the world gets to watch Keiser Report. You could also watch CNN, and CNN's going to offer you cover-up. They're going to tell you everything's fine, everything's A-OK, nothing's wrong. And what the wacky conspiracy theorists at Keiser Report who said there's manipulation of precious metals, and JP Morgan's manipulating the precious metals market. Well, cut to August 2019. 10 years after we had already warned you, another ex-JP Morgan precious metal trader pleads guilty to spoofing, is cooperating with feds. Another former JP Morgan precious metal trader pleaded guilty to criminal charges of manipulating the precious metal markets for 9 years, marking the latest in the Justice Department's crackdown in the commodity markets.
Right, it was obvious that insiders were manipulating the price, and we reported on that. And the thing about Bitcoin now is that it really can't be manipulated in those ways on that scale. And this is the comeuppance for the banks and the Jamie Dimons of the world, is that they've met a commodity, an asset class that they can't manipulate, that they could, every other asset class, stock and bond that's ever existed, they could manipulate it. Bitcoin, they won't be able to manipulate it in the same way. And for this reason, it will put those guys out of business.
But there's 2 points, the 2 headlines that prove that we won, that we were right from the very beginning. Like Harry McCarpolis had spotted that Bernie Madoff was a Ponzi scheme, that he was operating a Ponzi scheme. He looked through the numbers. He told the regulators, hey, regulators, this guy's running a Ponzi scheme. They did nothing because Bernie Madoff was respectable, like CNN was respectable in giving cover to these sort of people like Jamie Dimon. He's a hero. Remember, he was on the cover of like Time magazine as a hero who rescued the financial system, one of the heroes of our post-financial crash. We were identifying these issues, and we were right.
Well, I think that's the essence of financial journalism. I mean, other journalists, they seek the truth and to report on the truth, and they take interviews and they weigh opinions and they come up with what they believe to be the truth of a situation. Financial journalists would look at the numbers and the balance sheets and give, in this case, the truth that this bank was exposed. Now, that truth needed to be reported to the public, and the public had an opportunity to act on that truth. As a journalist, I simply provide the truth. I also mentioned that if you did take that action, the bank would go out of business. Okay, that's what I reported, and that's nearly what happened.
Of course, while we were talking about the plunder in America, they were like, we had Occupy Wall Street. We had what we coined GIABO, Global Insurrection Against Banker Occupation. And we were, of course, in America, they did not cover Occupy Wall Street. The media did not cover that. Here in France, remember, we also had the dégonflé. They would cut the tires of all these cars of the wealthy people in central Paris. We also had the boss napping because all these international multinationals were fleeing town. Everything was collapsing, and they were refusing to pay the pensions of workers. So they were boss napping.
France is always seething. There's always a protest or a demonstration Always.
Gilets jaunes today. So
it's
it's
just a
like
bigger manifestation.
we identified this trend back then in 2010, 2011. Here's a clip of us where we had actually made Urban Dictionary. For our 200th episode of the Keiser Report, there are some more presents here, Max. GIABO makes it to the Urban Dictionary. That's the global insurrection against banker occupation. GIABO is a movement and soon to be PAC that advocates for the people against the large banks that have come to occupy every level of government and influence around the globe. Let's go, GIABO. Remember, this is our liberation economics, which we're teaching you. You don't have to be the victim of JP Morgan. You don't have to be the victim of Goldman Sachs, the plunderers. You don't have to be the victim of the crime of our time.
Well, I had actual 1-ounce silver medallions minted, and you can find them on eBay with that phrase, global insurrection against banker occupation. They trade at a 500% premium.
But that's our point, is that we were identifying this trend that continues to this day. People on CNN, on MSNBC, on even Fox, who were totally surprised that Trump won. We, however, identified back in 2010 that this was going to be a global insurrection against banker occupation, against the elite, against the system which supports them, against the 0% interest rates, against the bailouts for the bankers, against the Cantillon effect that we've identified that helps the Rachel Maddows and the Sean Hannitys of the world, those who live in Manhattan, those who have those salaries, those who are asked on the media to tell us and explain to us and understand the world around us. They didn't understand the GIABO. They ignored Occupy Wall Street outside their front door in Manhattan. Rachel Maddow didn't talk about it. We identified that as a story. 10 years later, Trump is elected, and they act so surprised. It must come from a foreign government, somebody who understands us better than we understand ourselves. That a Keiser Report, if you had watched from the beginning, Trump wouldn't be a surprise to you. Brexit wouldn't be a surprise to you. Gilets jaunes would not be a shock to you. Hong Kong protests would not be a shock to you. But if you watch CNN, Fox, or MSNBC, it all will be a shock to you.
Right, and during the 10 years, there's been a transformation. People were protesting on the streets, and they thought that they were protesting in the vein of a left-wing socialist movement. But over 10 years now, everyone in the world realizes that they're attacking the central banks. Now, 10 years ago, that was a concept that nobody understood. No activist group that we spoke to understood that the root of all these problems were the central banks. 10 years later, they do, when you have people actually openly calling for the Fed to raise rates as a way to do battle against Donald Trump. So now we know what the battle is after 10 years. After we called it 10 years ago, the battle is with money and hard money and this fiat money. That's the battle. Because
the story never changes. As we said, with Bastiat had warned against plunder at the top, that it becomes a way of life in your entire economy. We also warned about the Cantillon effect. Again, a guy from Ireland hundreds of years ago who warned that those closest to the free money, those closest to the printing press, gain unfair advantage. So this is what we've identified. This is what happened with GIABO. Here in France, it continues, of course. And here's a headline just from this past week, what they're promising for September. They're ongoing. It's like the 43rd and 44th manifestation of this. Les Gilets jaunes promise a Black September for la rentrée 2019, which is now happening.
Right. Well, if you know your French history, as I was saying, they're always at the boiling point. There's always a manifestation about something. And the French, for 200 years, have been on the edge of their seat, hankering for a fight. And they detest the ruling elites who overstep their bounds. And, in the past, they've taken measures to restore what they feel is justice.
Again, this is about Keiser Report. It's not about the French people. It's about me and you and what we do on Keiser Report and what we're showing and educating the world about. Our view onto this is because we were looking at the economics. We were looking at the plunder. We were looking at the naked short selling. We were looking at the collateralized debt obligations that had faulty AAA ratings.
And John Law, who was the architect of the economics that led to the revolution, are being repeated by securitizing property to lend it into the market, as we've been talking about recently on our shows. It is the assignat all over again.
Yes.
So the
And
French have
Cantillon
led the
effect.
way in terms of defining what the problem is, and they've led the way in terms of what the solution is.
Yeah, so while we were living here, that was important to see that these people understood that the elite rip you off and that they're going to steal your stuff, because Bastiat was here and told them that plunder at the top ends up with plunder at the bottom. So you better stop it at the source right away before, you know, what they're always talking about, the purchasing power. They're obsessed with their purchasing power because that's a sign to them that the Cantillon effect is going on, that the plunder is going on. If their purchasing power is going down, somebody at top is stealing. And that's how you know, is when your purchasing power is going down.
Fraternité, égalité, liberté. It's all the same thing when you get right down to it. Thank God for Keiser Report. Well, that does it for the 10-year special show of this show. Max Keiser, my one and only Stacy Herbert, who made it all possible. Without her, I would just be on the street as a clochard. Look that up. Until next time, bye, y'all.